Okay, I think I'm going to declare it 10:15 and begin this morning's lecture, which focuses on the Chicago School, Vienna versus Chicago. If you heard my lecture yesterday, you saw that we had a way of morphing from a Keynesian system to an Austrian system to emphasize the differences. And I'll do something almost like that today, but not quite, because Friedman actually doesn't have a unique macroeconomic framework. He either piggybacks onto the Keynesian framework or he just makes do with the equation of exchange. And so we don't have something that's uniquely monetarist in that respect. But that doesn't slow us down much. In fact, it helps us see just where the big differences are between Keynes, or between Friedman and Hayek. Now, what I want to do for starters is put all three in perspective: Keynes, Friedman, and Hayek. And I have them listed here at the top from left to right in the appropriate array. You know, Keynes the leftist most and Hayek furthest to the right. And on policy issues, that's right. That's how they should be ranked. But one thing I want you to notice is that when we look at them on analytical issues, Hayek should be in the middle. That might surprise you, but we'll see the sort of an important sense where Hayek is between Keynes and Friedman. So I've written just a couple of blurbs here, or one blurb for each of the three. And I start out with Keynes, who of course does theorize at a high level of aggregation. Is one of the reasons that he's considered the father of macroeconomics, that he dealt with macroeconomic issues, that is, inflation and unemployment, at a very high level of aggregation. He argued that market economics perform perversely, and in fact his own terms was there were fundamental flaws in the capitalist system that his policies were intended to remedy. So they perform perversely, especially market mechanisms that are supposed to bring saving and investment into balance with one another. That's the loanable funds market, which he threw out. So seeing unemployment and resource idleness as the norm, Keynes called for counter-cyclical and fiscal monetary policies, and ultimately for, and this is in quotes from Keynes, a comprehensive socialization of investment. Now, Keynes scholars argue amongst themselves about what Keynes actually meant by a socialization of investment. I think I know what he meant, but it's in dispute among Keynesian scholars. So let's switch to Friedman, and you'll note that Friedman argues at an even higher level of aggregation. That's one thing that sets him apart from Keynes. The equation of exchange, MV equal PQ, and for those of you who took your macro more than 2 semesters ago, M is the quantity of money, V is its frequency of circulation, called velocity, P is the price level, Q is real GDP. And the equation really is an accounting identity. It says that buying equals selling, okay? The expenditures on goods is equal to the price of the goods times the quantity of those goods purchased. That's the equation of exchange. And he makes use of an all-inclusive output, that's Q, quantity output, putting into eclipse the issues of allocation of resources between current consumption and investment for the future. In other words, where Keynes would separate the two, C and I, consumption and investment, differentiating between them on stability grounds. Consumption is stable, investment is unstable. Friedman sees no reason to do that. He lumps them together and calls them Q. Friedman sees no problems emerging from the market himself. He's hardcore on markets in that sense. And so he focuses on the relationship between the government-controlled money supply and the overall price level, namely M and P. That's his area of interest. That's what he's made his mark in studying. More about that shortly. Now let's look at Hayek. Austrian macroeconomics is distinguished by its propitious disaggregation. I like the word propitious. I make my students look it up. It just means wisely chosen, well-chosen level of aggregations. You knew that, okay? And that brings into view both the problem of intertemporal coordination and the potential for a market solution. And this is why I say he's an in-betweener. He's not like Friedman, who says, there's no problem with that market. We won't even focus on it. It's working fine. We'll look at something else, namely the relationship between M and P. And Keynes is saying we won't pay any attention to that market because it fails utterly. We'll think of policies that will work in its stead. And Hayek says, wait a minute, he's sort of in the middle here. Wait a minute, that market is alive and well and can work if allowed to work, but it's very vulnerable, as it goes on to say, especially vulnerable to the manipulation of interest rates by the central bank. So this makes him sort of a middle ground theorist here. He's showing that market can work, but boy, you have to be careful. It has to be allowed to work. Now, don't worry, I say methodological reckoning, but I'm not going to steal any of Roderick Long's thunder, okay? I'm not that methodological. I'm an economist, not a philosopher. A very accurate description of Keynes and the way he goes about doing economics was provided by Alan Meltzer in a 1988 book. And here's what he says. Keynes was the type of theorist who developed his theory after he had developed a sense of relative magnitudes and of the size and frequency of changes in these magnitudes. In other words, he just looks at the economy and says, well, what things are changing the most? And then when he identifies them, okay, those are the magnitudes that he uses to construct his theory. So if something isn't changing, it sort of drops out of sight. It's just background. And the things that are changing, and the more they're changing, the more he focuses on them, like investment spending, then that gives him his subject matter. Again, this is still Meltzer. Keynes concentrated on those magnitudes that change most, often assuming that others remain fixed for the relevant period. Yeah, like the structure of production, the fixed structure of industry. Assume that he didn't see any wild changes in it, so let that be fixed. Or even the wage rate, it hasn't changed much, so assume that is fixed. That's from Alan Meltzer's different interpretation, so-called. It's really just reading Keynes for what he says. Now, my own commentary on this is that Keynes evidently did not develop a sense of what was going on within the macro magnitudes, but nonetheless felt quite justified in ignoring all such issues. So never mind about the structure of production or what market mechanisms might be at work there. They're not part of his theory. Okay. Now, I dwell on Keynes, at least that much, to show that Friedman buys into that very view. So here's Friedman writing about Keynes. He says, I believe that Keynes' theory is the right kind of theory in its simplicity, its concentration on a few key magnitudes, and its potential fruitfulness. The potential fruitfulness comes from what I call the gatherability of data. In other words, you can find data on these key magnitudes and put them to use in econometric equations. If you've done your econometrics, you know you have to have magnitudes that change in order to get results. You can't have a constant independent variable. It's not going to tell you anything. It doesn't change. We'll see more about that later. That's a direct quote from Milton Friedman. One of the famous quotes that Friedman uttered is, we're all Keynesians now, and he complains that he was quoted out of context. Maybe people thought he meant that he was for discretionary fiscal policy, or he wanted to pump up the money supply, or something like that. He says, no, that's not what I meant. But what he did mean is we all use the Keynesian language and apparatus, all right? So the Keynesian model, and the one that Friedman used was the so-called ISLM model, which is a step beyond the simple Keynesian model. we all, now who's all? Does it include the Austrians? Well, no. They just get ignored. So we all, meaning monetarists and Keynesians, use the Keynesian model. In fact, one of Friedman's claims is that, yeah, we use the model, but we draw different conclusions. And that's where Friedman made his mark. I'll show you a little bit about that later. That's quoted out of Time magazine in '68. Maybe I should mention that that was in '68. In '71, Friedman published a long article, I think actually it was a two-part article in successive issues of JPE, in which he set out the differences between Keynes and himself. And he did it strictly in terms of Keynes' own model, the ISLM model, or the model that grew out of Keynes very shortly after the general theory. And he showed that the relevant differences were simply differences about judgments in which curves were stable and which not, or differences in judgment about whether a curve was elastic or inelastic, which tended to depend on whether you take a short-run view, Keynes, or a long-run view, Friedman. And that's how he spelled out the difference. And so he was a Keynesian then, for sure, because he was using that Keynesian framework. Years later, in fact, 1999, there was an interview with Friedman in which he said that explaining his own theory in terms of the Keynesian framework was the biggest mistake he had ever made in his whole career. Well, I'm sort of glad to hear that, but it left unanswered, so what framework should you have used? And he actually didn't have one except the equation of exchange, MV equal PQ. And that underlies most all of the empirical research that he and the other monitors have done in any case. Now here we contrast with Hayek. Hayek's methodological presuppositions here. The role of the economist, Hayek points out in The Pure Theory of Capital, is precisely to identify the features of the market processes that are hidden from the untrained eye. All right? You have to go beyond what even a journalist can see with changing investment or changing levels of interest rate or whatever. Go beyond that and as a trained economist, look for market forces that might not otherwise be obvious. Of course, those are the very things that Keynes tended to ignore. So for Hayek then, cause and effect relationships between central bank policy during the boom and the subsequent economic downturn have a first order claim on our attention. In other words, let's look at what was going on during the boom to see why we had the downturn. All right? Now, it's true that after we got the downturn, a bad situation became a worse situation. But Hayek doesn't pay that much attention to it. He identifies it as a secondary contraction. He certainly recommends that the government not try to re-stimulate the economy. But he pretty much leaves it to economic historians to identify all of the perversities of government policy that made a bad situation worse. And if you've heard, I think you've heard a lecture already on the Great Depression, and you know what some of those policies are. So for Hayek, of course, it's the boom that you have to analyze to find out why there was a bust. Friedman would take a very different view. In fact, I think I've got Friedman's view here. Oh, this is still Hayek, where he's comparing essentially his view with Friedman. He says there may well exist better scientific evidence, by he means econometric, he's putting it in quotes, that is empirically demonstrated regularities among key macroeconomic magnitudes for a false theory, which will be accepted because it is more scientific, okay, than a valid explanation which is rejected because there's no significant quantitative evidence for it, all right? So it's hard to tease quantitatively evidence out of the boom to predict that there would be a bust. But if we understand the dynamics of the market, in that period, we can predict that, and I'll show you that shortly here. Now, Keynes attributes the downturn to psychological factors. In other words, he really doesn't pay much attention to the boom. He just starts his analysis with the downturn. Psychological factors, that's the animal spirits, affecting the investment community. His main focus, however, is on the dynamics of the subsequent downward spiral, on the policies aimed at reversing the spiral. So he's just showing what the particular mechanisms are that the economy spirals down once it starts spiraling. Okay. Friedman is dismissive of the whole issue of the cause of the downturn. And I've become sensitive to these phrases that I've got in quotes. He refers to the downturn as a run-of-the-mill recession or a routine recession or a garden variety recession, as if, oh, that's just inherent in market processes. You have these recessions. So he focuses on the policy blunders that occurred on the heels of the downturn and on the correlation between the decrease in the money supply and the fall in nominal GDP. Right? So he's looking once again at M, money supply, and nominal GDP, and even real GDP once he controls for price changes as well. So very different focus based on different methodologies. Hayek focuses on the policy-infected aspects of the boom and their implications of the boom's sustainability. He leaves it largely to the economic historians to detail the policy perversities and the hard times that characterize the subsequent depression. Okay. So here's Friedman's monetarism. Again, MV equals PQ. There's a mild upward trend in velocity as his statistical studies show. We're going to ignore it here and just let V be V. Leave it constant and keep it in the back of your mind. You might have to make some adjustment for a slight upward trend in velocity. And output Q grows slowly, and so it might be worthwhile to talk, at least initially, about a slow growth or even a no growth economy. In those instances, the price level P moves with the money supply. If the money supply goes up, V hasn't changed. Q, if it's increasing, it's low single digits, maybe not at all. And so the prices go up, okay? This is his monetary theory of inflation. The cause and effect relationship goes from M to P. And yet, puzzlingly, and even Friedman has been puzzled about this for some time, with a lag longer than you might expect, 18 to 30 months. Why would it take 18 to 30? That's 2.5 years, 30 months. Why would it take 2.5 years for prices to adjust to an increase in the money supply? But Friedman is an empiricist, and that's what the data show. There's long and variable lag. It varies from episode to episode. It varies from one economy to another. All right? So you have a lot now packed into the theory. You have an assertion of cause and effect, which I think he's right about this. It's increases in the money supply that cause increases in prices, not the other way around, despite some political rhetoric about the Fed printing enough money so that you can pay the rising prices. I like that one. So he's got the cause and effect right. He's got the lag in there. Okay. So that's monetarism in a nutshell. In fact, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That's one of the most quoted statements from Friedman, and he pretty much won the day on that one. Even the Austrians would say, yeah, if that's what you're looking at over the long term, the general price level pretty much tracks the money supply. So Friedman's monetary rule, though, that he milks out of this, is that the money supply should be increased at a slow and steady rate to achieve long-run price level constancy. In other words, now we take into account the fact that the economy does grow in the low single digits, maybe 3% or maybe 4% sometimes, but low single digits. And so if output is rising and velocity is not changing, if the money supply doesn't change, that would put downward pressure on prices, price deflation. Hayek would be comfortable with that. Yeah, if there's more output, people can buy things more cheaply. Nothing wrong with that. That's not an unhealthy situation. But Friedman suggests that we increase the money supply at the same rate that output is going up, and then with a constant velocity, that means that we have constant prices. And that standard of constant prices, that sort of benchmark, that's what we want. Friedman doesn't actually defend. He says, well, there's just a long tradition of monetarists that have taken constant price level as the hallmark of macroeconomic stability. And so he accepts that and says if that's what you want, then you need an increase in the money supply. But the Austrian would ask, what happens within the Q aggregate as a result of the monetary injection? In other words, there's stuff inside that Q, namely consumption goods, investment goods, and all the different stages of production. What happens within that aggregate? And you know what happens. We saw that the other day. You have a supply and demand for loanable funds. When the Fed increases the money supply, it lends money into existence. Whichever of the various monetary policy tools that it uses, they're all different ways of lending money into existence. And so the money supply, or the supply of credit increases, and the interest rate is bid down, so you have artificially low interest rates, and that's what causes the dislocation during the boom that eventually ends in the bust. Friedman turns a blind eye to this. Instead, Friedman declares the 1920s as the golden years of the Federal Reserve. In other words, look at the time series of the price level during the 20s, and it didn't change very much, except, well, right at the end, they started edging up before 29. In 28 and 29, prices were edging up. But by and large, they didn't change, and that got them the Golden Years Award from Friedman, which is to say the price level just didn't pass the Keynes criteria. So, that's not something he's worried about during the 20s. The implications, methodologically speaking, is that it takes a big cause to explain a big effect. Several of the modern economists, Bob Lucas among them, rule out any theory that hinges on interest rate movements on the basis that whatever the theory, the interest rate changes during boom times or during any times is just not great enough to explain anything big. Okay, there's small fluctuations, and small causes can't explain big effects. So much for the interest rate. And you can have an idea. Consider Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii. There's a big cause and a big effect. You can see how they're thinking. Okay, but think about a careless smoker in a forest fire. Okay, how big was that cigarette? Lucas would rule out that possibility before he started investigating. Right? Couldn't have been big enough. All right. Now, the more critical question here that Hayek would ask, and just why was it that the interest rate didn't change? And it turns out we could ask rhetorically, didn't breakthroughs in technology increase the demand for loanable funds and put upward pressure on interest rates? And see, we have Friedman or Hayek looking at the 20s with a historical eye. In other words, he sees that there were all sorts of innovations during the 20s in chemicals, in automobile production, in appliances, in processed food. Lots of things going on during the 20s, such that lots of investment opportunities and lots of business people borrowing money in order to take advantage of all the profit opportunities. That very fact should cause the interest rate to rise. Now, it turns out it wasn't allowed to rise, and the reason it wasn't is that the Federal Reserve was keeping it from rising. In other words, they were following what's called the real bills doctrine, which was to provide whatever credit was demanded without mentioning, by the way, at what interest rate, and they took it to mean at whatever interest rate prevailed when the demand increased. So any increased demand for more credit was met by the Federal Reserve with increased supply of credit, and that kept interest rates from rising. So if you just look at the time series and see what interest rates did during the 20s, they didn't change much. But they would have changed much. The natural rate of interest would have been higher had it not been for the Fed keeping it from rising. Well, that's the same thing as holding the interest rate below its market level. And that is the source of the artificial boom, even though you don't have a ready measure of its size, because you don't have a measure of what the interest rate would be had the Fed not intervened, and you can't work with the interest rate as it was because it was a product of central bank policy. Before I leave that, in correspondence I've had from time to time with Friedman, on one occasion he actually sent me a printout of time series on interest rates during the 20s. And he wrote about it as if it was an argument stopper right there. He said, look, interest rates didn't change during the 20s. Where do you see the change? Well, of course you didn't, because of that real bills doctrine. Okay. So this is sort of a summary slide. Seeing no change in interest rates, Friedman dismissed interest rates as a potential independent variable in his econometric equation. See, Chicago people are econometricians. And you can't put as a dependent variable some variable that doesn't change, because it can't possibly explain the change in something else econometrically. Seeing no change in the interest rate when they should have risen because of technological advances, Hayek was able to identify some critical market forces hidden from the untrained eye. That's what the Austrian theory is all about. And I put in a query here: which view, Friedman's or Hayek's, is the more firmly anchored in the empirical, that is, historical circumstances of the 20s? I think it's Hayek, all right? He was paying attention to what's going on, what should have happened in the market given what was going on, and showed that why it didn't was because of the real bills doctrine, which gave rise to the artificial boom. Okay. Now, let's turn to Friedman's view of the monetary contraction. Again, it's all MV equal PQ. That's the framework, unless we use ISLM, and Friedman eventually abandoned that. It's the same story except in reverse. A sharp monetary contraction puts downward pressure on P, okay? And if on P and Q, if P is slow to adjust, like it was in the late 20s, early 30s, then Q will fall, okay? So the evidence, Friedman always bows before the evidence, he uses that phrase, shows that between October of 1929 and March of 1933, decreasing M was the essential or primary or dominant cause of the decrease in Q. Okay, so we had a decrease in M. It fell by a third over that period. Money supply collapsed. The money supply, while under the control of the Federal Reserve, collapsed. And just a matter of logic, that puts downward pressure on the product, P times Q. If you assume V doesn't change, then it puts a lot of pressure. It turns out that V does change, but V falls. In other words, people hoard money. They don't spend it. They spend it less frequently. So that actually makes the problem worse Okay? And further, P, which did fall some during that period, didn't fall so much precisely because of Hoover's policy. Hoover had a high wage policy. He threatened the loss of government contracts if business firms lowered wages. And so there was all sorts of efforts to keep prices from falling. Well, of course, if they keep prices from falling, it means Q falls all the further. Okay? So you get a big change in Q. Now, I've got, oh, what's this? I thought I cut that out. No, the case of the cabbage-eating Mississippi monster. I might as well show it to you. Because I was arguing with a Chicago type on email a few years ago. And I couldn't get him to see the point about, you have to look at the downturn. What caused the downturn? And he says, well, it was just an ordinary downturn. I don't want to let him get away with that. Why is a macroeconomist just calling it ordinary downturn and moving on to another issue? And so I put it in a different context. Suppose that in late October 1929, a 1,000-pound monster descended on Mississippi soil. Okay, it spent the next 3.5 years eating the cabbages and quite a few rabbits between Jackson and Pascagoula. By early March of 33, the monster weighed 4,000 pounds. Okay, big monster, Pascagoula. So 2 investigators are sent to Mississippi to get a handle on the situation, one from Vienna and one from Chicago. The Viennese investigator asked, where in the world did this hideous thing come from? You see. Now, here I've stacked the cards against the Austrian because it's hard even to imagine an insightful answer to this question unless, of course, the monster turns out to be the unintended consequences of some ill-conceived government bionics project, okay, which might be the case. Which, by the way, was the case in The Blob. Do you all watch you remember the movie? There are 2 makes of The Blob, and one was the Keynesian blob, and the second one was the monetarist blob, because it was an ill-conceived project of the government, that responsible for the blob. But anyhow, this is a government project monster. Okay. Now, what about the Chicago economist? Chicagoan shows up, shoves the Austrian aside, okay, and says, never mind how this thing got here. The real question is, how did it grow from 1,000 pounds to 4,000 pounds? How did an ordinary run-of-the-mill garden variety monster quadruple in weight in 40 months? Okay, that's the real question. Okay, Chicagoans answer, well, of course it was all those cabbages. Why do you say that? He couldn't get good data on the rabbits. So the correlation between cabbage consumption and weight gain leaves no doubt about the central issue. Okay, that's it. Now, do we suspect that data availability is what led Chicagoans to his conclusion, and that lack of hard data pertaining to the monster's origin caused him to be dismissive of questions about where the thing came from? These and related suspicions are what underlie the message in Hayek's Nobel address, The Pretense of Knowledge. In other words, if you're into econometrics, you might accept the cabbage theory, not even noticing that it's a theory about something different, even though the Chicagoan calls it the real question, how they go from 1,000 to 4,000 pounds. The real question is how to get there in the first place. Okay, enough about cabbage and so on. Monetarism has sort of fallen out of favor in recent years, recently dating back to the 1980s. And we can show you why. That, let's see, did that slide actually say something there? The point is that this relationship between money and the price level hinges pretty critically on the velocity of money not changing, or not changing very much. The velocity of money has to be fairly stable for this to work. And there you see inflation in the sense of a rising CPI, Consumer Price Index. And here we see the money supply. And if you look at the period up through about 82, prices track the money supply pretty well, all right? But if you look beyond 82, there are a lot of ups and downs in the money supply that don't show up in the price level, all right? And the reason for that is the velocity of money did begin varying substantially in this later period. The reason being the banking reforms that were initiated by the Carter administration and accelerated in the early Reagan administration. Let me see if I can explain it very quickly. Before the reforms in that period, there was a very sharp, very crisp distinction between money on the one hand and earning assets on the other. And that came in the form of what was called Regulation Q. That's not the Q in MV equal PQ. That's just the Qth regulation of the Federal Reserve. Follows P. Doesn't mean prices. That's just the Pth regulation, okay? But the Qth regulation essentially forbade the interest payment on checking account money and forbade the writing checks on saving account. So you could have money or saving, but you couldn't have a deposit that had both functions. Okay, you either write a check on it or you could draw interest on it, but you couldn't do both. All right? And that gave a crisp definition. That's why M1 became the monetary aggregate of choice. And that's why it tracks the rising price level so well before 82. But once Regulation Q was eliminated, then there was a blurring of the difference between money and saving. And there was no clear monetary aggregate that was the one to look at. And the different aggregates moved in different ways. Okay, so the monetarists have been sort of at a loss to figure out what aggregate to look at. Okay, I see. I see what I'm doing. Stay with me for a minute. Bradford DeLong, who's been a big critic of the Austrians, as some of you know, also a critic of the monetarists, and he showed what's happened to velocity over that period. And so the vertical axis is exaggerated, so it makes velocity look like it's going up steeply. It's going up pretty shallowly, actually, over a period of decades. But it shows that pre-1980, the trend line was pretty clear, and the actual velocity didn't vary from it much at all. But after 82, it was different. The actual velocity went up and down while and was way off of trend. Okay, so it just shows an empirical verification of that. Becomes unstable after 1980. Friedman's policy rule lost its velocity anchor. And I call this the irony of monetarism. In other words, the monetary rule that allows the economy to perform at its laissez-faire best presupposes a central piece of intervention, namely Regulation Q, that makes the money supply operationally definable. It was after the 1982 episode that Greenspan, who took office in, 86, I think, testified before Congress, and he made the statement in sort of a forlorn tone. I guess he always had that tone. Greenspan says, "We don't know what money is anymore." A comment that was actually picked up by Jay Leno and thrown up against Greenspan. He says, "Now, Leno says, now, I really don't know what kind of a person we need to run the central bank, but shouldn't it be somebody who knows what money is?" And of course, that's what explained why the Fed then switched from looking at monetary magnitudes to manipulating interest rates again. So when they're manipulating interest rates, then you're in for some cyclical ups and downs, which of course is exactly what we've seen. Implementation of the monetary rule requires a fixed and known commercial bank operating ratio. In other words, you have to know what the reserve ratio is and count on it not changing much, okay? You've got to know what the currency ratio is and count on it not changing much in order to increase the money supply by a prescribed amount just by increasing reserves. And so let's look, here I'm going to plot bank reserves, and I want you to see they're low level of reserves and fairly stable up to a point, and see if you can catch the point where that's no longer true, okay? Here come reserves. Oh, it was right there. So that's what reserves look like. Now that had an effect on the money supply, but not nearly as dramatic as the effect on reserves, such that the reserve ratio now, far from being 5% or 8%, is 240%, okay? The banks have tons of reserves, far more than they have deposits. This is a big problem right now, and it certainly precludes manipulating the money supply by manipulating reserves. I've got more, well, here's the reserve ratio. Look at that, oh, there we go again, okay, that's the reserve ratio. Bring it up to date, I just put these on there this morning. Okay, there's reserves and demand deposits. You see, it's all over the place, and that flare up at the end still doesn't come anywhere near bringing that reserve to deposit ratio down. It's still about 240%. Now, here's the key question, and it's the one that allows me to morph from Friedman to Hayek, because the thing that Friedman has puzzled over the most, and in the last book he wrote, he had a chapter on unanswered issues, and one issue was this lag. Why does it take so long for increase in money supply to show up as nothing but an increase in prices? And so he tries his hand at it here in this particular publication. The publication he refers to actually was written back in the 60s sometime, that he wrote back in the 60s. And he brings in capital theory, but not Austrian capital theory. It's the capital theory of Frank Knight, which is sort of black box capital. In other words, the economy has capital, call it K. It's a capital stock. And from this stock comes a flow. The flow is output, strictly services, consumer services. He doesn't talk about consumer goods. If he talks about a lawnmower, that's part of the capital stock, and the lawnmower yields a service. Okay, your vacuum cleaner yields a service. Okay, everything yields a service. So you have a source, that's the stock of capital, a source, and the service. So in this quote, when you hear source and service, think the Hayekian triangle in the output of consumer goods. Okay, so I think I've got this here. Yeah, I've got a couple of screens, but let's read through this because it's really eye-opening, I think. So Friedman is trying to account for the lag between increases in M and increases in P. So he says holders of cash will bid up the price of assets. If the extra demand is initially directed at a particular class of assets, say government securities or commercial paper or the like, the result will be to pull the prices of such assets out of line with other assets and thus widen the area into which the extra cash spills. The increased demand will spread sooner or later, affecting equities, houses, durable producer goods, durable consumer goods, and so on, though not necessarily in that order. He said these effects can be described as operating on interest rates. He puts that in quotes. If a more cosmopolitan interpretation, I say Austrian because Austrians have a very broad interpretation of interest rates, is adopted than the usual one which refers to a small range of marketable securities. Okay, well, let's go on. The key feature of this process during which the interest rates are low is that it tends to raise the price of sources, that's the capital, of both producer and consumer services relative to the prices of the services themselves. Okay, so that's the malinvestment. It therefore encourages the production of such sources and at the same time the direct acquisition of the services rather than of the source. That's the malinvestment and overconsumption. But these reactions in their turn tend to raise the prices of the services relative to the prices of the sources. In other words, the process undoes itself. That is to undo the initial effects on the interest rate. The final result may be a rise in expenditures in all directions without any change in the interest rates at all. Interest rates and asset prices may simply be the conduit through which the effect of the monetary change is transmitted to expenditures without being affected at all. Yeah, without being affected after 18 or 30 months. Okay? So it's true, as Mises recognized in Theory of Money and Credit, that at the end of the boom and bust period, the interest rate would be close to where it was before. It may be a little higher, maybe a little lower, but close to where it was before. It's that period of adjustment. 18 to 30 months is a pretty long time. A lot of things can happen. And he goes on even more. Look, he says, it may be that monetary expansion induces someone within 2 or 3 months to contemplate building a factory, within 4 or 5, that should be FOUR, 4 or 5 to draw up plans, within 6 or 7 to get construction started. The actual construction may take another 6 months, and much of the effect on income stream may come still later insofar as initial goods used in construction are withdrawn from inventories and only subsequently lead to increase in expenditures by suppliers. Okay? Well, that sounds like the Austrian business cycle. In other words, he's saying, and he's bringing in the whole Austrian scenario just in an ad hoc basis to explain the length of the lag. But once he's, okay, that's the length of the lag. Now let's get rid of all that stuff. Okay. And we're back to MV equal PQ. So that's the morphing. Now, I got one more little segment here because it's revealing too. Friedman's Plucking Model. How many have heard of Friedman's Plucking Model? A few of you? Okay. A lot of audiences haven't. They haven't heard anything. And it's worth my while, I think, that this is sort of a story, an in-house story here that's fun. When the Review of Austrian Economics first started up, Walter Block was the editor. He had a particular strategy, and that is inviting critics of the Austrian school to write an article about what they didn't like about, say, the business cycle theory or whatever, and then having someone else do a response. That was the strategy. So Walter Block sent a letter to Friedman and said, would you indicate just what your objections are to the Austrian theory of the business cycle? And Friedman wrote back in pretty curt terms and said, I've already explained that, and I'm not going to turn to it again. So Walter wrote again very apologetically, I'm sorry I missed that part, and where did you write this? And so he writes back again. He says, well, it turns out I didn't mention the Austrians by name, but I assumed you people would know who you are, you know. And he had written this report, written in about 1964. It was a preliminary report written at the NBER. And what he argued is that he said it's not that the Austrians have such a bad theory, it's that they don't have the boom-bust sequence right. He says it's really not boom-bust, it's bust-boom. And he says if you bow to the data, you'll see that there's a correlation between the size of a boom and the previous bust, and not a correlation. Did I have that wrong? He said there's a correlation between Yeah, that's what he said. And I have to get it straight. The correlation is just backwards what the Austrians would say. So and he illustrated this by what he called a plucking model. Here's the plucking model. You have an inclined plane here. It's my diagram. And on the vertical axis, you can put most anything as long as it's big enough. Real output, real income, employment, just put a big macroeconomic variable there. And you put time on the horizontal axis. And he says if the economy didn't have any problems with cycles, it would grow in a secular way about like this plank. But now he imagined gluing a string. I don't know where he came up with this metaphor. Gluing a string on the bottom of the plank and then plucking the string down. It's not an elastic string. How far can you pluck it down? I mean, people think, well, if you pluck it down, it'll spring back or something. No. It's kind of like it's a taffy-like thing, a string of taffy. And you pluck it down, at various points and to various extents. And that gives you a pattern, and here's the pattern. Okay? And it looks like that. And he identifies these down plucks as busts and the up plucks as booms. Okay? Well, of course, it's not. The down pluck is caving into depression, and the up pluck is eventual recovery. All right? But he calls it bust and boom. He says the Austrians, they have a neat theory, but it's not a theory about anything, because what they need is not a boom-bust theory, but a bust-boom theory. And so that's why he's dismissive. Let's see. Oh, there's Friedman. Okay. I'll get rid of him. Now, you can see what the problem is here, and that this big aggregate output and so on, it's way too big an aggregate. In other words, if he's adding together both investment and consumption, and he's adding together all of the stages of production, then he's going to miss the relative movements within them. So if investment goes up at the expense of consumption, he'll miss that because one went up and one went down. Or if some stages go up at the expense of others, he'll miss that because some go up and some go down. All right. So in my response to Friedman, I pointed out how it is that the problem occurs during the segment where it appears to be glued to the inclined plane. But if the interest rate is wrong and you have misallocations, then the glue comes undone, okay? And the economy caves into depression, experiences a bust. So his level of aggregation is too high even to bring the boom into view. And what he identifies as a boom is actually recovery from a depression that followed the boom. Okay. We finished a few minutes early. Thank you very much. I'll take a couple of questions if anybody wants to ask. Yes, sir.
Could you go over Regulation Q and its relevance again?
Regulation Q came in during the 30s as part of the banking reform. The question is what's Regulation Q and its relevance? It came into being during the 30s as the government reformed banking, thinking that it was commercial banks themselves that had caused the boom and bust. And so it tried to restrict them on what they could do with their deposits. And it divided the options between providing checking services and paying interest. And disallowed the paying of interest on checking accounts, disallowed the writing of checks on saving accounts. All right? And that essentially it put an interest rate ceiling on checking accounts at 0, okay? And for some savings accounts, it put interest rate ceilings at 3 3/4. It changed over time some, but 3 3/4. That all came undone during the double-digit inflation of the Carter administration, because when inflation got up to 13%, the bank were in a heck of a mess when they could only attract money by offering 3 3/4% interest. And that's why it came undone, yeah.
Can you give an
What does it mean? Well, it means that, see, the way the reserves got increased is by Bernanke buying all of those toxic assets, taking them off the books of banks, and paying for them essentially with reserves. Just wrote those reserves into existence. But the banks that just sat on the money, they didn't lend it out because of tremendous uncertainties about what the government's going to do and uncertainties in the marketplace in today's economy.
What do you think will happen?
Well, I don't know, but the thing to watch is what's called Bernanke's exit strategy. And I've already talked to some people about this, but see, Bernanke knows that something similar to this happened in 1936 and 1937, when banks had built up reserves to about 40%, when what was required was 20%. And the feds got worried that the banks might start expanding, and so they raised the required reserve to 40%. Well, the banks started contracting because they wanted reserves over and above what was required. And that sent the economy back into depression for another couple of years. Now Bernanke has a new strategy, and that is that, and how many already knew this, that now the central bank actually pays banks to hold reserves. It pays them 0.25% now. And he wanted to introduce that policy, that instrument, so that he could raise it to keep them from lending out those reserves. So this is going to be an awful thing to watch, because if they start lending them out, then and he wants to rein them in, he just pays them more interest not to lend them out. But when he pays them interest not to lend them out, he's essentially giving them more reserves to lend out. Okay, and who knows where that process is going to end up? It's called positive feedback. Okay, yes.
The 18 to 30 month lag that Friedman couldn't explain, and you said like the Austrian critique on that, could that also be described sort of in terms of Cantillon effects? And then if you are waiting for the entire price level to change, that you won't notice as it's changing in sectors along the way? Is that what you
Well, I don't know. And Cantillon effects typically are sort of piecemeal for all individual prices and so on. I don't think Cantillon effects is something that would take that long to adjust. It's just that if it's so systematic with the interest rate being in play and stimulating these long-term projects, that's what gives you the lag. I'll tell you one way to explain differences in lag that's sort of favorable to the Austrian view, and that is that empirically, and this is my own finger in the wind empiricism, but I think it's right, that if you look at countries that aren't particularly capital intensive, like South American countries, for instance, and compare it to the U.S., which is capital intensive, you find that the lag is shorter in the less capital intensive country, longer in the more capital intensive country, okay? Which suggests that it is something about the capital stock or the capital structure that contributes to that lag. All right, so it sort of supports the Austrian view, supports it over Friedman's theorizing apart from the Austrians. He says it takes workers a while to straighten out the perception of just what the real wage is. And they have to adjust their expectations to the inflation. But if so, then he would have to argue that it takes Americans much longer to adjust their expectations than it takes, say, Bolivians. Okay, I don't think that's true. I think that there probably wouldn't be any difference, or if a difference, it might go the other way. Let me take one more question, then I'll.
How much does the 240% reserves align with the Keynesian theory of the liquidity trap?
Oh, not at all, really, because the reserves themselves, I mean, that's part of the banking supply function. It's not people hoarding money, okay? Okay, thank you very much.